research unjust incarcerations in the United States. So the phenomenon that I observed is the increasing popularity of the Innocence Project and its prominence in the current exoneration process in today's society, as cited by Godsey in 2006. There have been over 2,000 people exonerated for their crimes, and this number is continuing to increase. This is not a problem. However, the problem is that these innocent people were behind bars in the first place. So the question that led me to further my research was that why are innocent people being convicted of crimes that they did not commit? And I found through psychological manipulation used by law enforcement, as well as faulty eyewitness testimonies being used during a court of law, innocent people are being convicted of crimes they did not commit. The implications of my research. So, the implications of my research showed that government reform needs to be made in order to protect and preserve the rights of United States citizens in a court of law.
Deep breath. Deep breath.
There is also language that is protecting United States citizens, such as the Fifth Amendment and Miranda rights, but this language is too complex and vague for everyday citizens to understand, so it needs to be rewritten and composed in a manner that eliminates any of these complexities. Also, psychological manipulation and outright lying to suspects during the interrogation process needs to be eliminated because of its negative results. So the limitations of my research. National law requires states and citizens to follow certain regulations, but then state and local governments are also allowed to implement their own laws, which could vary from state to state or town to town. There are going to be other causes of unjust incarcerations that I will not cover in this presentation because I focus on false confessions and eyewitness testimony. And some of the articles that I chose to use in this research may not be relevant due to the years that they were created. And some articles that conducted specific tests did not create proper control groups during their testing, which will not give them the most accurate results possible. So in 2008, Casson conducted a study to figure out why society believes that false confessions are a farce. He concluded that there are 5 beliefs that society holds that puts law enforcement on a pedestal. The first is that society believes that false confessions do not exist. This was contradicted by Wynn Bryant in 2016 and Wolford and Wells in 2018. They discussed 3 specific reasons for false confessions occurring. The first is the Reed technique. The Reed technique was developed in the 1960s, and it was created based on non-threatening questions asked by a law enforcement officer to the suspect in question during the interrogation process. These non-threatening questions are supposed to create a safe environment for the suspect, but then as the law enforcement officer notices the nonverbal and verbal cues provided by the suspect in reaction to their non-threatening questions, they decide to pursue further with more intense questions that create an unsafe environment for the suspect. They feel that the only way to escape this unsafe environment is to confess to the crime committed, leading to a false confession. Negotiation and compliance models are also an important factor in false confessions. This is commonly known as good cop, bad cop models. A law enforcement officer will pretend to befriend a suspect during the interrogation process and will convince them to confess to the crime in order to give them the best outcome by helping them out in the court of law and trying to make their sentence minimal. This will also lead to a false confession because they don't want to be in prison for an extensive amount of time due to previous law enforcement threats. There's also eyewitness photograph selection and eyewitness testimonies that will lead to someone falsely confessing to crimes. Gorenstein and Ellsworth conducted a study in 1980 where a culprit had barged into a room and then abruptly left. The students in the room were asked to select from 12 photos who the culprit was. However, the culprit was not presented on the 12 photographs, and every student selected an image anyway without stating that they did not see the culprit on the images. Between 4 to 6 days later, every student was presented with 6 more photos. Each was made individually for the student. It consisted of the previous photo that they selected, 2 photos that they were also seen on the previous 12 images, 2 brand new photos, and 1 image of the actual culprit. They found that students were most likely to reselect the person that they had falsely accounted for the first time, rather than selecting the true culprit, which concluded the research that this eyewitness photograph selection should not be valid in any case. Eyewitness testimonies were also proven to be unreliable because of every time someone remembers an issue or an encounter, they lose memory of the situation each and every time. Berman, Narby, and Cutler conducted a study in 1995 where they had an eyewitness knowingly lie to 12 members of the jury, and then tell a consistent testimony to 12 members of the jury. So they had the eyewitness say that they had identified a brunette defendant, and then that was consistent with all of the other evidence. But in a second run of the test, they had the defendant say that the defendant should not be described as a brunette, and they feel that they are blonde, and all these other accusations and claims that did not coincide with the other evidence in the case. But the jury still believed the eyewitness and made a guilty verdict, which proves that the eyewitness testimonies are not reliable, and juries are not able to properly interpret eyewitness testimonies. The second belief that Casson developed based on society is that society believes that the constitutional protections are actually received by every individual in a court of law. These are specifically the Fifth Amendment and the Miranda rights. Mason-Rosano in 2003, Harkins in 2012, Bearcat in 2018, and Schatz in 2018 all unanimously found that these rights are composed of complex and vague language that is not properly interpreted by any suspects because they aren't unable to comprehend what is being told to them. All suspects have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, and that is the Miranda rights that are presented to them. But during the action of detainment, suspects are too anxious with what is going on to actually understand what is being told to them, because all that goes through their mind is, oh my gosh, I'm being arrested, oh my gosh, I'm being arrested, instead of, oh my gosh, these are my rights, and I don't have to say anything, and I also have the right to an attorney. And some people who actually are aware of these rights are susceptible to authority figures, because the police convince suspects that if they assert their rights, that it is just proving that they are guilty, because an innocent person shouldn't need to remain silent or require an attorney. Society also believes that jury members are able to distinguish lies through their intuition and corroboration, which Casson and Wishart disproved in 1985. And through the prosecution, it takes advantage of the jury's seemingly appropriate mental abilities, and they will make statements that will be objected in court, but once they state the statement, it will stay in the jury's mind throughout the rest of the trial, and just because it is objected doesn't mean they will forget it. So even when confessions are recanted in the court, prosecutor will still mention that the defendant had confessed to the crime, which gives a sense of that they are guilty. And then they also will reference a prior criminal record, even if it is completely disregarded by the judge and is not important to the case. But the fact that they have a prior criminal record makes them more makes the defendant seem more guilty than they actually are. The fourth belief that Casson developed in 2008 of society is that society has faith in law enforcement. So they believe that police experience and truth identification through the verbal and nonverbal reactions I discussed earlier with the Reed technique, and that's what I've been discussing. And Casson in 2008 did conduct research to discredit one of these 5 statements, and this is the one that he discredited. So he he ran a study to see, he gave cases, obtained cases from law enforcement who had decided who was guilty or lying in an interrogation to 10 average people, and they all were all equally unable to decipher who was telling the truth or who was lying, as the law enforcement officer was, which shows that the police experiences should not be a factor in believing that these confessions are reliable in any way, shape, or form. And society also believes that the court will determine the reliability of confessions before they're presented in the court of law, which Zalman, Rubino, and Smith had discredited in 2019, because they realized that the backup of all the evidence in court due to overflow of criminal activity makes them go through cases faster and admit more and more evidence into cases, even if it's unreliable, such as a recanted confession. And then these end up in court, which makes the jury believe that the defendant is guilty even if they're innocent and had falsely confessed to a crime due to psychological manipulation. So overall, I found in my research that psychological manipulation and eyewitness testimony are unreliable and should not be allowed to be used in a court of law, and that reforms need to be made that will protect citizens from psychological manipulation in an interrogation room, which will end up leading to a wrongful conviction. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thanks. Go through your reference pages. Yep.
There's 4.
Yep. Just want to make sure you had them there. So we're going to go through your oral defense questions. Your first oral defense question is about the process. When you think about and reflect upon your research process, what part of the process helped you the most to lead to your new understandings, your conclusion?
So the process, creating my annotated bibliography helped me understand the most, because I really had to connect with the articles and know what they were about. And by knowing what they were about and the tests that they were conducted, I was able to make my own inferences about ethics and moral code with what should be allowed or what shouldn't be allowed in the court of law.
Okay. Thank you. Next question is about information. If you were to look at your research, what holes do you think are left in your research that you would like to conduct further research on?
So one of the studies that I had mentioned was Gornstein and Ellsworth in 1980, and they had the photograph selection of 12 possible culprits when none was actually presented in the lineup. And because they lacked a control group, you're unable to properly say that people are unreliable as eyewitnesses in that manner. So if there was a control group and they still found that people were more likely to not select the culprit, it would have been a more reliable source. So I would probably rerun that study with a control group.
Okay. And if you had, let's say, another week, all right, what else would you add to your research?
I probably would have researched more in depth the actions of the court when they obtain all the evidence, such as confessions or eyewitness testimonies, because there was some lacking evidence in that area, but the prominence of false confessions and eyewitness testimonies seemed more important to me, so I focused more on that.
Okay.
So I focused more on the court.
All right. Good job. Deep breath. We're done.